Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You are listening to the Startup Selling Show, talking sales with Scott Sambucci. That's me. Today's episode is a guest episode, and today's guest is David Priemer. David is, one of those people, probably a lot like you and me, who never thought he would end up in sales. So he started his career as a research scientist doing things with test tubes and differential equations. And he was actually an award-winning research scientist before spending the next 20 years leading top performing sales teams at high growth technology startups, including one that was acquired by Salesforce, where he was a VP of commercial sales and creator of the Sales Leadership Academy program. Today, as a result of his 20 years of experience selling and leading sales teams, he is now the founder and chief sales scientist at Cerebral Selling. David's unique science and empathy-based approaches to driving revenue and talent growth have been published in the Harvard Business Review, as well as Forbes, Entrepreneur, and Inc. magazines. Sometimes he's referred to as the Sales Professor. And he is the author of the best-selling book, Sell the Way You Buy. And that book, Sell the Way You Buy, is really the backbone of our conversation today. A couple of the topics that he and I talked about, we sort of used the book as a guide, but we certainly didn't go from top to bottom, kind of jumped around a little bit. But I do want to make sure that you listen for a couple of the key topics that I think are really important and give you a reason to listen to this episode and my conversation with David. One of the things we talked about was the importance of positioning how you are phrasing a question. So we talked about things like objection handling or answering or asking questions that you might want to learn. So for example, in sales, we want to figure out, like, do they have budget, or is this the person with authority? Well, we know we can't ask those questions directly. And if you do, you're probably going to get a pretty terse response. So David talks about a specific strategy that we can use as a way to communicate the questions that we need to communicate to get the information that we need in order to deliver the proper sales process. We talked about this notion of experience asymmetry and how do we communicate with our prospects in a way that they are thinking. So many of the examples that David talked about is always talking about sales from the customer's standpoint. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What is their perspective on what they need to do in order to solve the problem that they have at their business or the challenge that they're trying to overcome with their company? And the more we can continue to think about that customer from their standpoint, the more effective that we're going to be as sellers. David and I also talked about the importance of what he calls polarization. So many of you who started your company, started your startup, so many of you that work at startups, you joined that startup or you started that company because you have a mission, you have a vision, you have this old way versus new way of doing things. And that's an important message that we can use as part of our marketing, can use as part of our sales process to communicate with customers, to get them to follow us so that we can be the leader to that solution as opposed to having to chase after them. So the idea of polarization in your messaging can actually be very, very effective. So instead of worrying about this FOMO of, like, I don't want to annoy people or I don't want to piss people off, it's actually better to take a stand. So it's a better way for us to filter out who the real prospects are versus the people who may not be a good fit for our product or service. We talked about buying experiences and customer feelings when they're going through this buying process. We talked about the idea of the Disney experience and what does it take to have a Disney experience in the selling process? How do we become more human? How do we become more empathetic? Instead of trying to push people into meetings and push people into demos, how can we look at it from their standpoint and give them options, make them feel like they're more in control and that we are more human on the other side of that phone or the other side of that Zoom screen? And one of the last topics we talked about is the difference between value and ROI. We often talk about ROI and value synonymously. David actually thinks about them very differently. ROI is the business case. Here's the reasons why you should buy. Spend 100,000, get 10 million back in return on investment. Those are important, part of the reason that companies are going to buy. There's also value, which David positions as the way that somebody feels when they buy and use your product. What is the value they're getting? And that value might frequently be qualitative as opposed to quantitative. So those are just a couple of topics that we covered. Again, all wrapped through the backbone of his book, Sell the Way You Buy. Make sure you grab a copy. I mentioned this in the podcast episode at the end. But certainly you want to go over to cerebralselling.com, which is David's website. Check him out. He's pumping out lots of free content, blog posts. He's got a YouTube channel. And of course, his book is a great investment. I bought a copy of it even before I met David. He was recommended to me from a friend of mine. He said, "Hey, you should meet David. I think you guys would get along pretty well." And so I checked out his book. I was like, "Hey, I want to grab a copy." Bought a copy myself. and just basically ransack the book. If you're watching the video, you can see I've got tons of post-it notes in here, lots of notes. So I could vouch for the quality of the content in the book as somebody who's been doing enterprise sales for 25 years. Definitely a great perspective. So, and most importantly, some useful guidelines and tips and tools that you can use right away to adjust your selling process, to make it more empathetic, to make it more buyer-centric, so that you can sell the way that your customers want to buy. So, all right, if you're not sold on this episode, I don't know what will. So that's it for now. Let's head over to my conversation with David Priemer. David, how are you?
Good, Scott. How are you?
Dude, so good to talk to you again. We've had multiple Zoom calls now, and this is the first one we get to record for the general public to listen to.
For sure. I said it's like a support call. Like we know if we're in trouble if we don't show up on a week-to-week basis. So no, it's great to be back with you.
Well, what you just said to me before we got on was we should do a call once a week. So I know that you didn't get, what was it, covered by
trapped under a heavy piece of furniture.
Trapped under a heavy piece of furniture. Yeah, exactly. Nobody wants that. Fortunately, I'm at a state in my life where I can hire people to move heavy pieces of furniture for me. I'm too old. I tried to move a heavy ladder the other day and tweak my back. That's how I know. Almost.
You got to be careful. I call them like old man injuries. When I wake up and I've somehow twisted my knee in the middle of the night, I'm like, oh, come on, I didn't even do anything. Like, least, let me have something heroic that I injured myself.
I know. I'm a pretty fit guy, but then I tweaked my back lifting a ladder for my son so he could have a place to put his new bike. And I'm like,
come up with a better story.
Yeah,
old man injury. That's right.
Yeah, I was battling the saber-toothed tiger. Well, listen, David, I'm so stoked to have you on the show here. I've got, as I showed you before, I've got your book and lots of post-it notes, which I know we're not going to get to all the questions and topics, but we'll get to as many as we can. So I hope you can talk fast. So before we jump in, for the people that haven't come across you or your book, Sell the Way You Buy, when people ask you, hey, David, like, what do you do? How do you describe that for folks?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of different ways I describe it, but one of the ways I say is hey, look, do you ever wonder why you don't like talking to salespeople, right? Especially if you're in sales. And a lot of times I get exactly what you just did, Scott, like the laugh, like, oh yeah, like salespeople are the worst, right? But that's what we do, right? And so I work with sales teams who realize that people love to buy stuff, but they hate talking to salespeople. But we are good people, right? We're just out there trying to help. And I spend my time trying to unpack why people don't like talking to salespeople and trying to help modern salespeople, sales professionals learn how to do this amazing profession with science and empathy. So we become the kind of people that people want to talk to.
Well, and your origin story is you're like a lot of really great salespeople. You're not a salesperson by trade. You have a science background. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, I love the phrase origin story, but it makes me feel like I'm like Wolverine or something like that. But no, yes, I started my career like everyone else. The running joke is that no one gets into sales on purpose, and I'm no different. And mostly because we don't teach it in school, right? There you go, right? Scott, what did you do before you got into sales?
Well, I was in sales out of college, basically. I was a history major. I've been writing a blog post about this, and I've done some interviews about it. Like, I was a history major, so either what do? You teach. Well, I dropped out of the education program in college. I didn't want to be a teacher. You can work at a museum. Not a lot of jobs doing that. You can go to grad school. I applied to 2 places and didn't get in. So I got to pay the bills. But guess what? I do sales.
Got to do something. Like, it was at the bottom of the list. I'll just do this. Like, and it's not like medical school or accounting where you need a degree or there's like some, certification board that you have to pass. Like, no, everyone can get into sales. I was no different. So I started my career as a research scientist. Similar to you, I did an undergraduate degree in chemistry and physics. And then I said, okay, what am I going to do now? And
chemistry and physics is way different than history.
That's true.
I was pre-med for a year and I dropped out of that because I was like, nah, this ain't for me.
No, look, you know what? It's okay. We're all on this journey of discovery. I ended up doing, after that, graduate work in engineering and ended up joining a startup at the turn of the dot-com boom. So around 1999, 2000. And absolutely fell in love with sales. I actually joined the startup as a sales engineer, solutions consultant. So shout out to all the solutions consultants out there. And that was, over 20 years ago, fell in love with sales and never looked back since then.
Okay. And that was WorkBrain that you were working with?
That's right. Yeah. This is an enterprise workforce management software company. We were 20 people when I joined. And then we hit at the peak 700 people, and we turned it into a $100 million business over the course of the next several years. We IPO'd 3 years into the business, and it was an awesome group of people, an awesome experience, just kind of seeing how the sales machine kind of ramps up like that. So yeah, that was a WorkBrain.
And so from there, you ended up doing some consulting work, and then found yourself at Ripple, which was acquired by Salesforce a few years after you were there as well. So this is turning into like sort of a repeat performance, I guess.
Yeah, no, so after WorkBrain, I went and I joined another startup, and then some of the leaders from WorkBrain called me up and say, hey, we're putting the band back together. We'd like you to come play with us. I was like, oh no, like I just started at this company and I really like it. And I was like, okay, fine, fine, let's do it. And it worked out great. We built this company 3.5 years later, got acquired by Salesforce, which was for me like the ultimate, being able to see how the sales machines are built operationally and culturally at scale. And I was at Salesforce for five awesome years. And interestingly enough, I ended up running small business sales for the Eastern US for Salesforce, which was cool because I was now servicing customers that were like me when I was a Salesforce customer, growing at my startup. So that was kind of cool.
So maybe that's a place to kind of like, speaking of origin stories, because I want to get to like how you got to a place where you wrote the book, Sell the Way You Buy. So you're a sales manager at Salesforce, you're managing a team. And I read this in the book, you're coming up to end of quarter, like every other sales manager out there, push, get the deals closed, sign the contracts, do whatever you have to do to make the number. But it sounds like you had some kind of moment or epiphany where you like, this is just not right. So I'm curious to know, like, what was the epiphany? Because like every sales manager goes through this every quarter, and probably I suspect, whether you're a sales manager or even you're a CEO, you're just trying to hit your next number so you can raise the next round. We all know, like, I think intuitively as good humans, like this whole push thing just ain't right, but we do it anyway. So what was the difference between perhaps where you were in this and what did you see versus and taking this action versus people not taking this action?
For sure. Well, I think just in general in life, we get caught up doing things and we don't stop to question, like, why do we do that? Like, why did this person who's my boss tell me that I should be doing this thing? Is it still working? Does it make sense? And as a research scientist, you're always kind of conditioned. Like, what does a scientist do? Scientist learns, like their job is to learn and explain what they've learned to other people. So you're always kind of conditioned to ask why. Like, why does this happen? Why does that happen? And then, of course, being a startup guy, and I know a lot of your listeners are probably startup people as well. Like, we love to figure things out. That's why we enjoy the whole startup environment. And so kind of when I hit Salesforce, and I love my experience at Salesforce, obviously, like, that is a very mature, amazing sales machine. And so what that means is they just end up doing a lot of things because, well, that's what they did last year. And that's what they did the year before. And so the way I kind of start the book is I talk about, so I'm 45 years old. So in 1984, one of my favorite movies, The Karate Kid, came out. And that's how I start the book. I talk about the Cobra Kai. And I said, like, why does the Cobra Kai, like, why do they go around like picking on other kids and beating them up and all that kind of stuff? And the reason is because that's what their sensei taught them to do. And so, back to Salesforce, the things that they're doing at Salesforce are fantastic, and they're not categorically ineffective, and they're not unethical. But we end up doing them because that's what we did last year and the year before and the year before. And in general, I'm sure this exists at tons of other companies as well. We don't stop to say, well, why are we doing this? Like, is this still working? How do the customers feel when we use these tactics on them and so on? So that was kind of a bit of the epiphany, I guess, that I had trying to reconcile, as a former Salesforce customer, how we were treating our current customers.
Yeah. So this combination of being a researcher by trade, being a former customer, and then also looking at sales and being able to interrogate the process and feel like, okay, maybe this is working, but is there a better way? Somehow maybe it's suboptimal. There could be a better way of doing this.
That's right. Well, look, salespeople, and then look, sales is one of these things. It's like, we're like baseball, right? Like, as good as you are, the best hitters are only hitting, 300 and change. So in sales, there's bound to be a lot of rejections. That's normal. But when you start encountering like your unfair share of rejection or angry customers or people who, when you explain what you do, they don't really get it, then you start saying, okay, well, what am I doing? Am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? Like, what can I change? And it's not, and sometimes it's not just you. One of the reasons why sales has changed so much in the last little while is because the market has changed and the way people buy has changed. So unlike, let's say, medicine or math or accounting, which, makes changes, but not as, step function as we see in the world of, modern commerce, this is where salespeople really have to kind of rethink and retool what they're doing so they can connect with modern buyers in a way that makes sense for them today.
Well, and you've got some really great stories in the book itself. So I remember one of the things I read was one of your reps at Salesforce was up against Microsoft and their CRM, and the comment that the rep was like, well, if Microsoft is cheaper, why don't you just go buy Microsoft? And it didn't sound like it was intended to be, sarcastic. It was just like, well, it was sort of like an objection handling technique, which is like, do that, throw it back in their face. It's almost like call their bluff. And so, that prospect got very angry, right? You got an angry phone call as a result of that.
It's true. You know what? There's so much to be made of tone and word emphasis, right? We teach people, this is the thing that actually a lot of people, salespeople, they kind of mess up. And as sales leaders, we don't spend enough time focusing on this nuance. Is that, let's say, for example, you had a customer, I'll get back to the example you shared, but let's say you had a customer who felt that they were oversold, like you sold them on a feature that the product couldn't do that thing, right? And they call you on it, and just think about the simple phrase, I think I talk about it in the book. You might say, oh, I thought we were clear about that, right? Now think about all the various permutations of tone. You'd be like, I thought we were clear about that, right? Or you could say, oh, I thought we were clear about that, right? So tone can play a huge role. And sometimes, like for us, tone, we're almost like nose blind to it. Like we don't really sometimes, we're not in tune with the tone that we use. And oftentimes when we're not, the tone that the customer reads into our narrative is whatever mindset they happen to be in. So if they got in an argument with someone in the morning or they're pissed off, they're going to read negatively into your tone. So anyways, I had a situation where I had an angry call from a customer who said, yeah, why is your sales rep telling me to go buy Microsoft? Basically, we delivered the price and the customer said, oh, like you're double the price of Microsoft. And so the tactic is to say, hey, look, nothing wrong with Microsoft. They could be a great solution for you. And it's true, we do cost more. Why wouldn't you go with Microsoft? Like, maybe Microsoft is a good solution for you. I can do that very kind and empathetically, but I can also come off as like, oh, well, why don't you just go buy Microsoft then? Right. Like jerk. And so tone is very important. And I wish we taught tone more often. I'll tell you, so I'm a good Canadian boy. So back in the day when I was young, I took an ice hockey. I played ice hockey for like 40 years. And I took I had to, right? I took a referee course. So like how to be a level 1 referee. And one of the things they teach you in like referee coursing or the course is like, what infractions? Like what is a tripping? What is a hooking? What does a cross check look like? And they show you different versions of those infractions. So when you see them on the ice, you go, oh yeah, that's a tripping goal. And so, but all these permutations of the same infraction can look a little different. And it's the same thing with tone in sales. That's the first time I've used that example, by the way. So thank you for, for indulging me in my hockey roots.
We're always looking. You've probably interviewed 100 times, so we're trying to pull out new stuff from you.
Yeah.
Well, I think the theme here, like going back to the whole title of the book, like sell the way you buy, like understanding, I don't even care for that word understanding because it can be difficult to measure. I think empathizing with the customer on the other side, when you talk about something as simple as how you address them or how you might try to counter an objection, you talk about tone and how they might receive it. That's somebody who you may have had, 5, 6, 7 conversations with over the course of a couple of weeks or months, even with Zoom and all the other great ways we can, create interactions with people that are at least somewhat proximate. Compare that to, over the last 12 hours, I've probably had 3 or 4 misunderstandings with my own wife, who I've been living with for like 15 years, right? Almost 15 years. I've lost track. I think it's 15 years. And that's somebody who I know knows me and who I know better than anyone. So that one intonation or that one word in a text message could be perceived as like, oh, are you upset with me? Or did I do something wrong? Or what did you mean by that? And that's your spouse,
That's right.
So you take that to the extreme case with customers. I think it's like getting into the weeds of like, what are your customers thinking, acting, doing, feeling when they have to talk to a salesperson?
Absolutely. Well, look, imagine, funny you bring up the wife situation. So, if I went to my wife and I say like, oh, hey, is your mother coming over for dinner on Sunday? She'd start like, hold on, is that, why are you asking me then? Why are you asking in that way? Like, what's the matter with my mother? Can't she come over for dinner? Right. So the tone, I didn't say it in that tone, but the tone is actually quite important. And the same thing happens even in sales when we ask what I refer to often as contentious questions. So when we ask someone like, what's your budget? Who's the signer? What does the approval process look like? Even those very simple questions that we are trained to ask as salespeople, by the way, can be misconstrued by the customer just based on the tone and approach that we use. And so if we want to collect that information, that's one of the challenges, right? We're taught to ask these questions. And yet sometimes we get off our customer calls and we don't leave with those insights because of the tone, because of the approach, because of the way we asked. And the worst part is we don't even realize that's why we didn't come away with those things, right? So it's really important that we be mindful of how we ask, the words we use, the tones, that we come off in the right way to our customers.
Well, and this is, you have a whole section of your book, chapter 7, just to kind of jump. We'll probably jump around in the book based on how the conversation goes today. But in chapter 6, I'm sorry, mindful discovery, like you talk about this concept of experience asymmetry, and you talk about this idea of going through these traditional BANT, budget, authority, need, timing, and that's what you just identify, which is like, do you have budget? Are you the signer? Those sorts of things. But I also feel like we do deserve to know, like we need to know as a salesperson, so that, yeah, as you mentioned later in the book, you should lose fast or make sure that you're getting the right people in front of you to solve the problem that they might have. So take a very direct question like, do you have budget for this? Or who's the signer on this? How would you advise somebody to turn that around, ask the same question using different words to get to the answer that you need?
Yeah, I know it's very, this is actually one of the simplest discovery tactics that I teach. And it's really easy. Like, again, this is a contentious question. So if I asked you on a personal level, a contentious question, like how much money do you make, right? Like how many partners have you had in your life? Like these are things you're wondering, hold on a second, like what the hell are these questions? And why does David want to know, right? Like for most of these contentious questions, it's always this matter of, what are they going to do with that information when I give it to them? It's like when you go into the car dealership and the car salesperson comes over and says, so, hey, Scott, like you're interested in, such and such a car. Can I just ask you, like, what's your budget for cars? And you're thinking to yourself, hold on a second, if I tell this person what my budget is, what are they going to do? Are they going to try to like upsell me? Should I lowball? So the easiest tactic, right? If that, from an empathy perspective, that's what's going on in the mind of your customer. They're always thinking like, who is this person? And why are they asking me? The easiest remedy for that approach is to just give them a reason why you're asking, right? So for example, if I were to say, yeah, Scott, what's your budget for this car? The reason I ask is because, now that's the key phrase. The reason I ask is because. So the reason I ask is because we have lots of cars and I just want to make sure I'm showing you the cars that are in the range that you're looking at. I'm just curious, what's the budget you have in place for this project? And the reason I ask is because some of my clients don't have budget allocated for this kind of project. And if that's the case with you, I'm happy to help you create it, but that's why I'm asking. I'm just curious, what does the signing process or approval process look for, like for this deal? The reason I ask is because you mentioned that you want it to be live in 30 days. And, there's a lot of, administrative stuff that usually needs to happen to make this deadline. I just want to make sure that we're aligned from a timing perspective. So it's not so much like, so the tone needs to be right. But in these cases, giving someone a reason to kind of quench their mind. Again, the purpose of your mind, of your brain, is to keep you safe, right? That's your brain spends a lot of time and calories. Your brain actually consumes 20% of the calories you eat on a day-to-day basis just to operate, keep you breathing, keep you moving around, and keep you safe. And so whenever we find ourselves in a contentious situation where our brain is on high alert, we get very anxious. It's actually the same thing, let's say, if you went to the doctor for like a medical test and you were waiting a week for the results to come back, your brain is working into overdrive, trying to think about all the horrible things that can happen to you, because that's its job, is to prepare you for the worst, right? But when you hear like good news, all of a sudden it calms the mind because now you have that certainty. And so whenever question you're asking, if you're going to use a tactic like the reason I ask is because, it's all about helping create a little bit of certainty in the mind for your customers. They know why you're asking. It takes the emotion out of it, and they can answer you in a very, candid and transparent way.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because especially as you mentioned, like a lot of the people that listen to the show are startups and startup founders. And one of the things that we teach all the time in our coaching program is we have to remember that usually, if you're selling Salesforce as a CRM or platform, it's like they probably already have a CRM in place, right? So they know how to buy a CRM. They've bought it before. They have some process, right? But if you're selling a new technology, maybe it's a platform or a product that's replacing SharePoint or spreadsheet or manual process or some 1998, DOS-based system, your customers actually don't know how to buy that. I mean, we had this all the time when I was selling enterprise software at Blend. Like we'd get to the procurement team and it's like, they actually didn't even know how to do risk analysis on the platform, like on how to do due diligence on a cloud-based system. And so even like asking like, hey, the reason I ask is oftentimes when we're selling to our customers, this is the first time they've purchased a platform like this. So they don't always know who the people internally should be. And we can advise on that. We're going to get the CTO involved at some point, or the risk officer is going to need to take a look at this. And that, I think, also gives you an opportunity to take the lead and get a lot more control in the sale, as opposed to just leaving it to the buyer.
Totally agree. Look, and taking that leadership role is actually quite important, especially if you're a startup or you have a new novel solution that people aren't familiar with, because they don't know how to your point, they don't know how to buy. You're not a Gartner Magic Quadrant, product. They don't know like what the comparable features and functions are. And so actually, I talk about this because some research from a little while back from Gartner, it was CEB, Gartner, they talk about the fact that the sales teams of the future are the ones that are more prescriptive. And so the example I often give, so, of course, let's fast, rewind like a little year and a half ago. I'm anticipating the launch of my book, and I'm going on like all this, like these speaking tours and all that kind of stuff. So what do? I go into the menswear store here in Toronto to get like a new sports jacket and to, new button down. Little did I know that we would be living our best, t-shirt and sweatpants lives for like the next year and a half at least. But so I go into the menswear store, and I'm in the market to buy a sports jacket, and there's like a million sports jackets there, right? And so if I were just to be left to walk around, wander, and pick whichever one I liked, I would have floundered. I would have been really frustrated, and I would have left with a product that may not have been the right one for me, with a high level of regret. But what they do in these menswear stores is they take control of you, right? You come in, oh, sir, like, how can I help you? And they ask you questions about, what are you going to wear this thing for? And how often do you buy this kind of product? And, do you need to shove it in an overhead bin? And then the guy comes back with like, here's the three, it's one of these, right? And they make it really easy for you to buy. And so I actually had this experience. I talk about this in the book. Our third startup, so this company Ripple that was acquired by Salesforce, what did we do? When you ask like, what do we do? I'm going to describe it in like the simple way. We were a feedback, coaching, and recognition platform. And so a lot of companies would look to us for this product to replace what they were doing on the annual performance review. Like, performance review sucks. We do it once a year. We need to get more feedback and coaching. But then when we would get the requirements from our customers, they would read like an old school performance review solution. And why? Because they had no frame of reference. They can't come to us and tell us, what the advanced features, of the future need to be. That's our job, right? So a lot of times, especially if you're in a new novel area of business, to come to your customer and be more prescriptive, lead them through the process, educate them, share what you've learned in the market so you can help them moderate their requirements. And that's what we did for so many customers, and it worked out pretty well. But yeah, leading the customer is super important.
All right, folks, we are off and running in my conversation with David Priemer. Really excited to have him on the show, and just excited to know that you're listening to the episode. One of the things that we do here each and every week is look for ways that we can constantly pump out new great content. So in addition to this podcast that we're publishing every single week, I'm also doing LinkedIn Lives on a regular basis, publishing content over on LinkedIn, publishing content on our email list. But one of the things that I've learned over the course of the years that I've more than a decade of doing this is that one of the best ways to learn is in a focused environment. And so one of the things that we do on a regular basis is run either an online webinar or a masterclass on a rotating basis. So if you've not joined us on one of our free trainings, one of our webinars, or for our full day sales masterclasses, then I absolutely recommend that you do that. So coming up very soon, we have our next masterclass. So if you go to salesqualia.com/masterclass, salesqualia.com/masterclass, you can get all the details as to when the next masterclass is going to be held. What you're going to get during that day, spending time with me, some guest experts, and a small group of fellow B2B startup CEOs learning how to build a repeatable, scalable sales process. So head over to salesqualia.com/masterclass. Check out that next learning event where you can learn from me and our guest experts and your peers that are out there doing this every single day. So that's it for now. Let's head back to my conversation with David. So how do you balance, or how does one balance the leading aspect that you're just describing, the education and teaching and showing, compared to, I think in the book you mentioned the Forrester research, and there's other research out there that, something around 60% of the buyer's process happens before they contact the salesperson, before they click the request a demo, before they're willing to take a call. So on the one hand, we know the buyers want to be in control. They want to do their own research. On the other hand, we know at some point we need to be in control, because if they're selling a new technology or a platform that hasn't existed, like in your case, Ripple, or in my case, blend, there's a bit of a counterbalance there. So what advice would you give to, a startup founder and somebody selling an enterprise solution to help them balance both sides of that, knowing that you have to do the education prior to getting the prospect on the phone, but then also knowing that the prospect doesn't actually want to talk to you. They only want to talk to you because they feel like they've exhausted their information gathering that they can do on their own.
Yeah, well, look, this is where marketing comes in sales and marketing, like we got to be like this, because part of what you need to do if you're a high growth, early stage or, novel company with a new solution is you need to be a bit of an evangelist, right? You got to put that vibe out there. You almost have to like hold a lightning rod and say like, here's what we are, here's what we believe. And if you believe what we believe, then come along for the ride. So marketing plays a huge role, but I would say like the number one thing, if you ask me for one piece of advice, because your product is going to be new, it's going to be interesting, it's going to be something that maybe your customers haven't seen before, don't lead with the product, right? Lead with the problem, lead with the pain, I talked about this, polarization, lead with the enemy, because that's the thing that your customer is going to gravitate to, right? They don't care. The product doesn't make a difference. If I came to you and I said, hey, look, I believe that there's a lot of bad salespeople out there, but those bad salespeople, they're not bad people, right? They're good people, right? They're just trying to do their best. I also believe that sales is the best profession when you do it the right way. And I also believe in the future, if you want to be a top seller, you need to execute with science and empathy. And I can say all these things, and in none of that did I explain what I do. I didn't say, oh, I train salespeople and I have slides and this program and I wrote a book, right? All that's the what. That's secondary. The first thing is like, who's the enemy, right? Bad salespeople, old outdated tactics, the realization that you don't like talking to people like you. So that's what I lead with. And in your business, that's what you should be doing. You lead with the enemy, don't lead with the product, lead with the enemy. But also keep in mind that things that your customers find as the enemy, as the pains and challenges, can vary based on their role, based on the size of their company. It could be even vary if you have a product with 3, 4, 5 features. It could also vary based on the feature that you're selling. So in a way, you don't always have to worry about having that one statement that's just going to crush every single customer. Just wrap a narrative, like a human sounding narrative around what it is you do, focused on the pain, focused on the problem, and put that out there consistently in your narrative and your marketing content. And so when your customers come to you, they don't need to know all the nuts and bolts. Oh, you're a platform for, no one gives a shit about your platform. Okay. But they know the problem that you solve, the enemy. And if that enemy is unique and differentiated, then they'll lean in and they'll say, tell me more about this. Right. And that's when you've earned the right to go deeper.
Yeah. And what you're describing in chapter 5 is the high impact messaging chapter. You've got this 5-step framework, which is polarization, juxtaposition, provocative questions, convictions, and storytelling. And so I think this polarization, I think it's hard for founders, to be willing to pick an enemy because they don't want to miss out. It's sort of this fear of missing out. I don't want to piss somebody off, or, if somebody comes in and they don't, if they're not on our side of things. But on the other hand, they actually started the company because of this exact reason. The status quo is no longer acceptable, like using spreadsheets and SharePoint and manual process or whatever. That's why they start. That was the enemy that they're fighting. Yet when it comes out to the go-to-market strategy, they feel like they seem to abandon that for some reason.
Well, look, especially founders, we fall in love, right, with our product. This is our baby. We fall in love with it. When in reality, like, again, we should just be falling in love with the problem, because in your business, the product will probably change over time, right? Like the product will change over time. The features will change over time. But hopefully, the mission, right, doesn't change over time. And that's the thing you really have to lead.
I love that.
Yeah, that's what the thing you have to lead. Because like, think about this, right? Like imagine you're in a relationship with someone and now all of a sudden you get into some tough times, right? Let's say you're married. I'm married to my wife. You're married to your wife. And back when we first got married, we had all these amazing dreams and things that we were going to do in life. And then we hit a rough spot. And that's like your startup, right? You're working with a company, you're working with a customer, they fall in love with you, and then you hit like a rough patch. Your product doesn't work, it doesn't scale, like they get locked out or like something bad happens. And you kind of always want to go back to that point in the past and say, you remember, we're still the people that got together 10 years ago, we're still those people. We still believe, we still want the same thing. And if you align with customers that believe what you believe, they will give you extra chances, right? They will cut you extra slack. They will be along for that journey because they believe that's what they're buying at the beginning anyways for. Like they're not buying you because you have 1 million customers and achieved, incredible success. They're buying because they believe in the vision, right? So lead with that belief, lead with those enemies, lead with those messages. That's what's going to attract those customers and keep them close to you throughout your journey.
Yeah, I love that. So again, I know we're almost going in reverse with the book. But in order to, like, one of the things you talk about in chapter 4, which is buying experiences and feelings. So we're kind of like now getting into the mind of the customer. We want them to feel what we feel. We want to have them on our side. We're leading the crusade for the cause. It was described to me that way by someone in the past. And in the book, you talk about how the product is, or the experience is product, or product is experience. They're the same. And you talked about an experience you had at Disney, and how Disney is this magical place. There's cast members, and it's pretty well documented about how effective they are in terms of thinking about the customer experience. Or everyone, there's no customers, there's guests. Framing things in the positive. What time does the park close? Well, the park is open until 9:00. All of those things. And so if we want to create that experience, that Disney experience, an enterprise sales process, how do we do that? Whether it's, post implementation and you have a maybe client that's a little bit feeling a little roughed up because things aren't going as planned, or even earlier in the process where maybe we haven't quite built the trust that we need to drop those moments in. Like, how do you think about that? Or how could you create a Disney experience in the selling process?
Yeah. Well, look, so there's a couple things. The overarching thing I think about is just be a human being, right? And what does that mean? It means, people tend to over-engineer in sales and marketing. We think of like really fancy words and terms and things that we wouldn't say to another human being if they were our friend, or, we were having a colloquial conversation. So just use like really simple, basic human feeling terms and treat them like a human being. I know it's sometimes tough because when we kind of put the body armor of sales and marketing on, we almost like act like a different person. And this is actually one of the reasons why, especially when you have a lot of young sellers, you can tell this concept you mentioned earlier that I talk about, experience asymmetry. It happens when you have a younger or less experienced or newer seller calling on a more senior level decision maker whose job they've never done. And what happens is, it's like when my kids, I know you have kids too, when my kids come to me and they're about to hit me up for something, like I can tell immediately, right? Just by the tone, just by the way they approach me, right? I mean, it always, tends to put me in a defensive state. Like they say, like, Dad, I'm like, the answer is no. Whatever it is, now what's your question? Because I can feel it. Like I can feel it. So when you approach your customers and you start using fancy words and terms and you start giving them these polite interrogation style discovery conversations, like they can feel it. And it feels like a forced human interaction, right? And so you need to have that feel very, very natural. So that's, I'd say, the first thing. But also, a lot of what's wrapped up in the experience are the very simple things. This is actually an experienced personal trainer once told me, they said, look, being a great personal trainer isn't about being like ripped and jacked and being able to do all the exercises. It's about 90% is showing up on time, being organized, being courteous, like having a plan, communication. And those are the same things I would say, from a sales role perspective as well. It's just, be a human, be responsive, like add value, be organized, be on top of your customers. I can't tell you how many times, even in the last week, where I've reached out to clients who, let's say they wanted to do something with me, and then, I hadn't heard from them for a week or so. And then I touched base and I said, hey, I know you mentioned that you wanted to have a conversation about A, B, and C. And they thanked me for following up, not in a, like a fake way, but like, no, thank you. This was something I wanted to do. And I know that I got a million things to focus on even now. So look, I appreciate you staying on top of me. And that's the way it should feel, just being organized. And look, technology can help us there too. But, it's a lot simpler than you think. But oftentimes it requires us to undo some of the things that we've been taught or learned over the years.
You just reminded me of my son last night. We're sitting on the couch watching Mythbusters. And about 10 minutes in the episode, I hear, hey, Dad, I totally get if it's not okay, or if the answer is no. But I was wondering,
what a way to start a pitch, right?
Would it be okay if I had some ice cream? I was like, God, it's like, is he like tapping into my phone calls? And so then the negotiation began, because he had already had some cookies over at a friend's house. And I'm like, okay, like how much? You already had some cookies. And he's like, well, but they were small. and I only had like 5 of them. And then the dance started. We finally settled on 1 scoop of ice cream instead of 2, and everybody was happy. But like you said, he just started with this very empathetic. Like, I totally get the answer's no. It's totally fine, but I was just wondering if I could have some ice cream. And it's true. I mean, that was like the right way, instead of just like blurting out, I can have some ice cream. Because what my brain as dad brain would have kicked in and be like, no, you already ate cookies. You don't need any more ice cream. But he softened me up. He let me
Yes.
know that no is an appropriate response here, even though I knew that he knew that no was not an answer that he was willing to take.
Well, no, I think it's fantastic. So I talk about it in the book, this concept of reactance, this idea that when we limit our customers' ability to choose freely, like when we say like, oh, so hey, Scott, we had a great conversation, or if you're interested in this, how's next Tuesday at 2 p.m. for a follow-up chat, right? You're like, whoa, hold on a second. You're coming on pretty strong with all these like very specific directives and schedules, right? But if I said, hey, look, hey, Scott, do you think would make sense next week to have a conversation about A, B, and C? And if the answer is no, like that's okay too. Like I'm giving you the option. Now, of course, I need to add value before I give you the chance to pull out. However, if I approach that narrative, so I think the way your son did is actually not too bad. But if he approached it from a very fearful perspective, and if he said, hey, look, he said, it's okay to say no, but, and then here's my question, that's okay. If he says, you're probably going to say no because I had a lot of, cookies before, but, like, well, of course, what am I going to say? Or if he kind of approaches it from a tentative perspective, like I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure he's going to say no, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if I give you the option saying, hey, look, Dad, I recognize, I know I'm just called you Dad. Dad, I recognize that, hey, look, I've had a lot of stuff, I can't be having sugar all the time. However, if I approach it from a normal perspective, then, it makes it more likely you're going to say yes, because it doesn't, instigate that automatic no nerve that you mentioned.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to what you were talking about earlier with like younger, less experienced salespeople. They're sort of like, everything is so automated now. It's like so easy to hit the automated outbound sequence. It's so easy to like send the Calendly link. It's so easy to have replies set up in your email box and scripts. And then we have this, this task of like, okay, you're an SDR and you're an AE and you're a CS and you're account manager and you're SE, that we sort of forget the whole customer experience. It's sort of like, push the button, get enough messages out. And so as you were talking through all this a couple minutes ago, I was thinking about the old Jerry Maguire, the answer is like fewer customers, more compassion, really care for our clients. But that's kind of what we're talking about here. It's like, yeah, it's just being a little bit more human and taking some extra time. Like I had a text exchange this morning with somebody who was interested in jumping on a strategy session with me. And I knew it was interesting and he was interested in doing it. And I even like in my message, I said, listen, man, sorry for the early morning text. Jocelyn and I are lined up the rest of the week. I got us down for a call next week, but I haven't heard back. Are you still interested or should we look to push it off? And then boom, within 20 minutes, I got a reply back and text and all this stuff. And now we're scheduled for the following Thursday. And sometimes it's just like a timing thing. And to your point of like, hey, how about next Tuesday at 8? Well, like maybe next Tuesday is the day they got to drop their kid off at school, So maybe give them options or like, hey, we could do a call, or some people like to join our webinar that our CEO is going to be teaching. That might give you a better context for how we approach the problem. So before we jump into a demo, if you don't want to just jump into a demo right away, that could be a really good option for you as well to get more informed about how we approach the problem.
Yeah, well, look, just being aware, I think this all comes back to just being aware of the customer's mindset. One of the examples, I always like to give examples that have almost seemingly nothing to do with sales. But like if you ask someone out on a date and they didn't want to go with you, what do you think they would say? If I say, Scott, hey, look, what are you doing next Saturday night? Do you want to go out? And you don't want to go with me, right? What might you say?
I don't know. I've never had somebody turn me down. They'd probably say,
wrong guy to ask this question.
No. They'd probably say, I mean, of course they're going to say like, you know what? I'd love to, but next Saturday I'm pretty busy.
Pretty busy. Yeah.
But let me think about it and then I'll get back to you.
So there you go. So I'm pretty busy. So now I'm wondering, okay, like is Scott really busy or does he just not want to go out with me? He's just being really nice, right? And so if I recognize that that's what's going on in your head, one of the things I could do is I could ask you to test you. I could say, hey, look, I totally understand. I kind of sprung this on you at the last minute. What about next Saturday night? And now if you give me the, oh, you know what? I'm kind of busy next Saturday night too. Now I have this sense, okay, I don't think he wants to go out with me. So now, but he's just being too nice. So if I say, hey, look, all good, and like, I'm happy to find some time if you do want to go out, but if you don't, like that's okay too. Like you can tell me no. I'm okay with no also. And
Yeah.
now all of a sudden, I'm reaching into your head and I'm pulling out what you're thinking, which is, shoot, I don't want to let this person, I don't want to be like rude. I don't want to have to get wrapped up in a thing. So I'm giving you an easy out, right? And you might take that out the same way when you're offering customer options. Hey, look, if the commitment of a big 1 hour demo is too much, maybe why don't you just join this group webinar, or you can watch this recording. And if you like what you see, then we can take the next step after that. How does that sound? Instead of Saturday night, what about Wednesday afternoon for coffee after work, right? So I'm giving you options because I recognize that you may not want to commit to the thing that I'm offering you, right? And so just getting into that customer mindset and providing options, making it easy, again, back to like that human level, make it easy for the customer to take the approach that you want. I'll tell you one funny thing, and I'm looking over here. So I had some business cards made up. Actually, not having business cards was a source of pride for me, right? People would say like, oh, do you have business cards? Do you have business cards? My kids would say, because my kids think business cards and merch with your logo is the coolest. They would say, Dad, do you have a business card? And I would say like, no, like we're living in the future here. Who gives people pieces of paper? We're exchanging pieces of paper. And then my oldest daughter, she said, but hold on a second, Dad, didn't you tell me that if you want someone to, take the direction that you want them to go in, shouldn't you just make it easy for them? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, isn't it just easy to just hand someone a piece of paper with your phone number on it? And I'm like, okay, crap. Right. So therefore business cards, right? But that's the idea. Just make it really easy by getting in the customer's head and figuring out like, what is it that they're thinking? What is it they want? And try to give them options to make them feel comfortable.
Yeah, this is good stuff. Man, we could go a lot of different other directions with the conversation. What's something that you haven't shared on another interview, or something that maybe was in the book that you think that got edited out? Is there something like a lesson that you wanted to teach that you're like, like I wish I had room for one more chapter?
Oh my gosh. Well, there was a lot of stuff. The book was already, 70,000 words. So I had to kind of cut it off somewhere. So there was a lot of, for example, negotiation stuff that I wanted to get into that I didn't have a chance to. Oh, of course, you could argue there's a lot of objection handling and discovery tactics and negotiation. But I would say more so than that, there's actually a lot of timely tactics that have come out and people are more aware of it since the book came out in the last year, especially you write a book for a year and a half and then it gets released at the beginning of a global pandemic. And then so much happens in that next year. And the stuff in the book is 100% relevant to the stuff happening now. But there are additional lessons. And so, one of the things that I talk about in my thank goodness I got, a blog and a YouTube channel, I can put out more stuff. One of the things I talk about is this idea of value and ROI not being the same thing, right? I say, salespeople are conditioned to sell value. And I do talk about this in the book, value versus ROI, this idea that value is a discretionary feeling. Like think about something that you spend money on that another person would look at and say, Scott, that's ridiculous, right? You got fancy running shoes or your running coach. We're like, what the hell are you doing spending money on that? But you value those things, right? It's a discretionary feeling. So that's what you spend money on. Return on investment or a business case, something completely different. Now, I will defer you to the content in the book where I talk about that. However, one of the things I talk about is that the things that people value, and this is what I've been talking about since the book came out, the things that people value change over time. So think about a business that was trying to grow back in, early 2020, who 6 months later was just trying to survive, right? Or their industry was completely crushed by the pandemic. Or I think like, imagine you were a hospital and you were buying PPE like 2 years ago, right? You're buying masks and gloves and all that kind of stuff. What do you value? Well, you probably value price is important and quality is like, all right, it has to be good enough. And, speed, all right, like when it gets here, it gets here. We got enough of this stuff. And now fast forward a few months later, and what is it that you value, right? You don't value price anymore because you can't get the stuff. So I'm willing to pay whatever it is to get the stuff here. Quality has to be super high and speed, it needs to be here yesterday. So the things that your customers value will change over time. And if you're still going to market with the same pitch that you were going to, a year ago, then you may not be successful. Think about something that's just as simple as like, why do people invest in sales training? right? Like you might think, well, at a basic, people invest in sales training because they're looking to see an increase in some kind of conversion metric that's going to result in more revenue for the company. And so like, we're going to teach our salespeople to ask better questions, do better discovery, do better negotiations, and boom, more money, right? That would seem to be why someone would invest in sales training. However, in the pandemic, where people are working from home, talent is changing hands very quickly because people are realizing that they don't want to work for the company that they're working for now. Or they realize that, look, I've been sitting at home with very little engagement and my company is not investing in me and my personal development. So I'm going to go someplace that does, because even though that was the case before, I'm really feeling it now, right? And so there's lots of reasons why companies are making decisions now that are different than they were a year ago. And so I'd say like the principle is the same I talk about in the book: value, focus on value, that discretionary feeling that they're buying, but understand that that could have changed over time. That's definitely one of the things I've been talking a lot about in recent months.
Well, I love that perspective because it goes, again, into the whole premise of the book, like sell the way you buy. It's like, what are the buyers thinking about? And yeah, there's the logical argument where we do an ROI assessment and our cost benefit analysis. And okay, you're going to spend 100K with us for this platform and you're going to solve a $10 million problem. There's your ROI. Send this to the CFO so we can get it approved. That's important. You got to do those things. But that's usually like an end of the sale activity. You're not going to, open up your lead gen with that. You might say like, hey, a lot of our customers get, see as much as 50x ROI in over a 3-year period. Maybe I could show you how this might work for you. That's appropriate. But ultimately, if you're trying to make that connection, trying to build that trust, trying to get into a relationship, like getting clear on like, why are we having this conversation in the first place? What is it that you're thinking about? Because that value thing could be, for somebody as they're growing, it's like, I need more freedom in my day, right? I need a system that's going to automate a bunch of processes because right now I'm spending 2 hours a day updating spreadsheets. And those are 2 hours that I'm realizing that's a complete waste of my time. And those are 2 hours I could be helping my kid with school, or I could be helping my wife out around the house, or she could be, instead of being the stay at home, instead of her having to be the stay at home mom, maybe now she could go back and pursue her career again. I mean, there's all these reasons we don't know until you ask.
Absolutely. Well, look, even the problems that you're looking to solve for your customer, we all think that we're like this unique, delicate snowflake, but there's other companies that can probably solve that customer for the, solve the problem for the customer in a slightly different way. And so the question always becomes, okay, so why should I pick you? And imagine you are a small, scrappy startup and you're competing against a larger, incumbent vendor like Salesforce says, hey, like we can do everything. Like we got all these products, we got the ecosystem. You don't need to go to this small vendor. You can work with us. And the benefit of working with us is like, we're this big magic quadrant vendor, high security, high integrity, all these great things. So if you're a small, scrappy startup, how are you competing against that? Well, you might say, well, you know what, with us, you can get access into our product roadmap, and you can get access to our executives. And when you call us, like we'll pick up the phone and we're just down the street and we're more accessible and all these things. And if the customer values those things, then you're going to be in shape. If there were no customers that valued like the scrappiness and the innovation and the fact that you're putting out like new revisions and sprints every week instead of a release once a quarter, right? Like then no startup would be successful. The fact that customers do value those things means that if you're a startup, you can rely on those things. At the same time, it was funny because when my startup all of a sudden gets acquired by Salesforce, now we can't say those things anymore. So now we need to change our narrative. So now we say, well, our customers love us, not necessarily because of our, now we don't downplay like our agility and the fact that we, put out, revs once a week, but they love the fact that they can run their whole business on our platform. And they love the fact that we're super secure. And then we're in the Gartner Magic Quadrant and we do all this good in the world. And if that aligns with what you value, then you'll choose us. It's like the old phrase. Have you ever heard the phrase like no one ever got fired for buying IBM?
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that IBM has the best products and services? No. It just means that they're appealing to someone who's afraid of losing their job by making the wrong vendor selection. So that's what that person values. And think about like if you're in IT security, you're selling your IT security software, and now you're selling it to someone who just had a data breach, right? And now they're going to lose their job if there's another one of those data breaches, or even worse, right? They could be sued. The thing that they value is different than what it would be if they had not gone through that experience. So whether you're a big company, I know a lot of our listeners here are startup people or high growth people, you need to go into a kind of a value place where your competitors can't go, right? And lead with that. Because at the end of the day, that's what your customers are buying. Talking about the experience of the product, a lot of times they'll do business with a small, scrappy startup because they love that small, scrappy startup mentality and all the things that come with it, right? So lean on that. Like at the end of the day, that's what they're buying as much as your technology or platform.
Yes, they're part of the team. It's us versus them.
Absolutely.
We talked about earlier. Dude, I love that. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Certainly would love to keep going and talk more about the other 17 questions I had ready to go. So we'll have to do
round 2
or 3 or 4 or whatever. So right now, like, tell us, the folks listening, like, where are you focusing? Like, who are the kind of people that you help most right now, and how can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more about how you might be able to help them?
Yeah, well, I mean, coming from B2B technology background, I tend to work with a lot of B2B technology companies. So that's the majority of my clients. Typically, startups all the way to 1,000 employees and above. So that's where I tend to focus. Although I will tell you, I do have other mainstream, if I can call them mainstream clients. I have a client that does high-end dog food, and I love working with mainstream clients because I actually, I like to think I add a lot of value, but I learned so much about what exists around in like the non-tech world. And the problems are quite honestly the same, right? Like, why would this store owner want to, stock your dog food versus someone else's? A very like human kind of problem. So anyways, that's who I typically work with. And if you want to find me, I give away a ton of stuff online on my website, cerebralselling.com. So I have blog posts, videos, YouTube channel by the same name. And the book is called Sell the Way You Buy. And you can get that anywhere that you get books.
Yeah, I totally recommend grabbing a copy. Like I said, I bought a copy even before you and I had chatted. We were introduced by a mutual friend, Jason Bay. He's like, you got to talk to this guy, David. And so I went and got the book and read the book, and we got in touch. And I was like, all right, yeah, definitely. Our lives and careers have been very much in parallel. You also teach. I've done some teaching. You've 6 startups with high growth and written a book and all those things. So it's age-wise, we're about the same age too. So I love the Cobra Kai. By the way, as soon as I opened the first page, I'm like, I'm going to like this guy.
I knew my audience, I guess. I don't know.
Exactly. Absolutely. So I actually had a Cobra Kai t-shirt at one point.
That's, it's nostalgia. It's, look, that's the other thing, what people buy, we talk about, they buy feelings. I told this story, I don't know if I told in the book, but I talk a lot about it in my training when my kids years ago did a lemonade stand. Right. And they're out there and they're selling lemonade. I'm like, they're not going to sell anything. First of all, it's not, who the hell buys lemonade from kids on the street? It's not even hygienic, but like, they're going to have a blast, setting up this lemonade stand. And they made so much money in a small amount of time. I'm like, what the hell's going on? And part of the reason is people are buying feelings. They're buying cuteness. They're buying nostalgia. And so, anyways, I love the kind of the Cobra Kai stories. I also love, as you can tell, like, sales is all around us. And I believe that if you kind of stop and pause and think about life and the experiences that you had, there's a ton of amazing sales lessons in there.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. Well, thanks so much for sharing some of your wisdom and knowledge with us. Definitely, everyone, grab a copy. At a minimum, grab a copy of the book. You'll be glad you did. Do what I did, which is take notes, because there's lots of great stuff in here that you can implement right away. Share it with your team. Buy a couple copies. Share it with your team for sure. And in the meantime, David, I'll have to hit you up for part 2 or 3 sometime very soon. Thanks so much for taking time to join us here. Dude, let's talk again soon. I'll let that at least in a week, so I didn't get
That's what we were saying. Yeah, no heavy furniture.
Furniture.
This is amazing, Scott. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure connecting with your audience, and I hope we get to do it again soon.
All right, man. Thanks a bunch. Talk soon. See ya. All right, that's a wrap. So David has quickly become one of my favorite people in the sales world. Just really appreciate his approach to sales. Very human-centric approach. Very empathetic, obviously, approach to sales, and that's why he wrote his book, Sell the Way You Buy. The subtitle is A Modern Approach to Sales That Actually Works Even on You. So again, do make sure you grab a copy of his book if you haven't already done that. You can check him out over on his website, cerebralselling.com, as he mentioned. And if you've been listening to the podcast, whether it's your first episode or your 100th that you've listened to, I just want to say thank you. And one of the things you can do to help us promote the podcast, promote this content, is just leave a review over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to the show. Those reviews are what those podcast platforms use to recommend our show to other people just like you that need to be hearing and would want to hear content like the ones and the interviews that we're doing, the ones we just had with David. So if you would just leave a review, and also tell a friend or 10. If you enjoyed this episode, you think a friend of yours in the startup world or somebody that's focused on sales and growth could benefit from this kind of interview, then just, flick them an email or flick them a text message right now. Say, hey, check out the Startup Selling Show. You can search either for Startup Selling Show or just type my last name, Sambucci. As far as I know, I'm the only person with that last name doing a podcast. It usually pops up right away. And ask them to give it a listen. So that would help us get the word out to as many people as possible so we can help make the impact that we want to make with the startups and the startup founders just like you. All right. Well, that's it for now. We'll have lots more episodes coming in the very near future. Thanks so much for listening. And in the meantime, this is Scott Sambucci signing off.